All right. Well, everybody, welcome to the annual Elizabeth T. and Abraham P. Pawlowski Memorial Lecture for Emerging Scholars at Gratz College. My name is Daniel Levitt. I am the Daniel and Louise Cohen Director of Adult Jewish Learning here. And just to say a few words, this lecture series was dedicated by the Pawlowski's daughters, Joan Wall and Nona Levin Abrams. This year, we mourn alongside with the extended family and community the passing of Nona, who inspired generations and instilled the same love for Jewish learning in her children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. In presenting this lecture series, we recognize and honor the Pawlowskis' deep devotion to Jewish education. Throughout their lives, the Pawlowskis promoted Jewish values not only at Gratz specifically, but also as leaders and educators throughout the wider Jewish community. May their memory be a blessing, and may this lecture series continue to honor the Pawlowski legacy. In a moment, I'll turn it over to our keynote speaker, but one point disclaimer before we start, and then I'll give you his bio. The chat, you may notice, is disabled, but we will have a Q&A afterwards. So if you have a question, please, I encourage you to put the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and I will see that question, and I can moderate the questions at the end. And so thank you for participation with that. Our speaker tonight is Rabbi Dan Horwitz, who is a Gratz alum. Rabbi Horwitz is committed to fostering a joyful Judaism that's inclusive, inspiring, and relevant. He's a lifelong learner, and in addition to rabbinic ordination, he holds 3 master's degrees, like I said, one from Gratz, and a law degree. He now serves as the CEO of the Jewish Federation of Greater Nashville, but he's been a pulpit rabbi in a large synagogue, a CEO of a JCC, organizational rabbi for Moishe House, and the founding director of The Well, a young adult outreach and engagement initiative, which under his leadership transformed young adult Jewish education in Metro Detroit and beyond. He's the author of the recently published book, Just Jewish: How to Engage Millennials and Build a Vibrant Jewish Future. And he was designated by the Forward as one of the America's most inspiring rabbis. Dan's a lover of hummus, Jewish music, jam sessions, shooting hoops, and he is grateful to be building a life and home with his spouse Miriam and their 3 rambunctious children. And we are grateful for Rabbi Dan's time and are looking forward to hearing more from him right now. Thank you.
All right. Good evening, everybody. Thanks so much, Reb Daniel. A pleasure for me to be here. Thank you to the Pawlowski family. I had the chance to read up a little bit on the folks who this lecture is named for earlier and was incredibly inspired by their commitment. I think it said at one point Abe was both a math principal and a lawyer and a religious school principal, and it definitely resonated deeply. And as a Gratz alum, it's such a privilege to be able to be here as part of this extended community. I was one of the early guinea pigs, I suppose. My master's from Gratz was in Jewish Studies, circa 2005-ish, in those days where the internet was not what it is today, and magically Gratz in so many ways has been ahead of the curve over the years. And I was actually able to earn my master's working remotely from Charleston, South Carolina, in my first job out of undergrad, while working as the ritual director of the conservative synagogue there. So really a privilege and special to be here. Thank you to the whole Gratz team, and again to the Pawlowski family for making tonight possible. I noticed that there's a little colorful background here. A couple of people inevitably, whenever I'm in a Zoom, ask me about who's behind me. Please let me introduce you to hipster Theodore Herzl, hipster Golda Meir, and hipster David Ben-Gurion. It's an Israeli artist, hipstery.com. It's a personal favorite. You get world leaders as hipsters. And in today's world, knowing that over my shoulder, I have the privilege of working on behalf of the Jewish people with some of the most incredible Jewish leaders in history, watching my work gives me a little bit of inspiration, even if my children are asking me, what is that in Golda's hand, because cigarettes are not allowed on television anymore. So who am I? I happen to be a rabbi, a lawyer, a community builder, a basketball player, a hummus enthusiast, a Detroiter, even though I now live in Nashville. I have 3 little ones who are 9, 7, and almost 5. And I'm really, really enjoying the privilege that I have now of serving community in this role. As Reb Daniel mentioned, I've been the rabbi of a large 900 plus family synagogue. I've been the CEO of a large JCC. I've worked for Moishe House in the innovation sector and had the privilege of starting the Well. And most importantly, out of all of these things and all of the degrees and the student debt is actually the most impressive piece of that, I'm a millennial. So what does that really mean? Who are the millennials? Well, if you're to believe the Pew Research Center, millennials are those who were born roughly between 1981 and 1996. That's kind of the key birth age range. Inevitably, if you were born within the handful of years before or handful of years after, you share a lot of characteristics with the generation. And the data has been really interesting over the years that's come out academically. We know that millennials are not as involved in Jewish life as previous generations were at their age. We learn that they're looking for new ways to be involved. One of my favorite learnings of any of the research that's been done is that millennials would rather express their faith by talking to their friends than by attending synagogue. Let's that one sink in. Half of millennials who identify as Jewish come from mixed families, meaning they have parents, one of whom is Jewish and one of whom is not. And over 70% of married Jewish millennials outside of the Orthodox population have a spouse who is not Jewish. Okay, so being of mixed heritage parentage and or having a partner who happens to not be Jewish is the norm for non-Orthodox millennials. Now, even within millennials, there are some differentiations, right? So I'm an old millennial, if I can call myself that. My first cell phone is when I was 16 years old, and I got my mother's hand-me-down 1994 Plymouth Voyager teal minivan. I was the talk of the town, soccer mom, shepherding all my youth group friends around in high school. But my first cell phone was a prepaid $50 card, ginormous phone that lived in the glove box of that car and was only to be used for emergencies only at roughly a rate of $3 a minute, is juxtaposed with younger millennials who grew up with cell phones as the norm, let alone now if you look at the generations that are following, my now 9-year-old at age 2 knew how to unlock an iPad, enter a code, and pick the app that he wanted to use. So digital nativism is something that comes more and more into play the younger you get within the generation in terms of comfort with technology, which is another thing to know. We know from a lot of the research that in the dichotomy of having universal or particularistic outlooks, that millennials in particular skew towards the universalistic over the particular, which has a lot of implications for us as we think about building Jewish community when folks view themselves as citizens of the world, as opposed to Jews who are also citizens of the world, and what the implications are of that. Millennials tend to fall into 3 distinct life stages: single, partnered, or parents. And it's really important to know that just because someone is single doesn't mean they're looking for a partner. There are plenty of millennials who are happily single. And just because somebody is partnered doesn't mean that they want to have children or that they will have children or that they'll be able to have children. Millennials are getting married much later than previous generations, often in their early to mid 30s on average. And as a result, they are having fewer children than previous generations. And because they're often starting later in terms of growing a family, for those who choose to, they're definitely having a harder time at times because biological realities come into play. So very, very important to think about when dealing with the millennial generation, to not make assumptions as it relates to somebody who's single wanting to have a partner, if they have a partner, if they want to have kids, you know, this old kind of Jewish stereotype of walking up to a couple and being like, no, so when are you having children? For all we know, they've been trying for 4 years and it's devastating for them right now that they haven't been able to. So we just have to be really sensitive and thoughtful. My favorite statistic about millennials is that in a recent study, 60% of millennials hate labels so much that they hate being called millennials. So this notion of people wanting to be identified with a particular brand or label is not speaking to this generation, which has significant implications as it relates to how we think about the way the North American Jewish community is structured denominationally in particular. Folks are not keen on saying, I'm a Reform Jew or I'm a conservative Jew, right? That there's this lack of desire. And the result is that they say, I'm just Jewish, right? And you can have folks who are like me, who had significant backgrounds, Jewish day school education, summer camp, youth group, all of these things, but courtesy of being in pluralistic settings throughout their kind of education and Jewish journeys, would say, I'm just Jewish. And then you may have someone who just found out last week that they happen to have Jewish ancestry, and they would say, I guess I'm just Jewish, and anything and everywhere in between. Just Jewish is the fastest growing category within the major demographic studies out there. And that's the reason that I ended up calling my book Just Jewish when talking about millennials in this generation. We know that many of these folks are institution phobic. And most importantly, I would say, despite being digitally hyper-connected, we talked about digital nativism a moment ago, despite being digitally hyper-connected, millennials are incredibly lonely. And it's not unique to millennials, by the way, but millennials, like many other generations right now, are incredibly lonely, even though they can text anyone on demand at any time. So why should we care about engaging millennials at all? Well, I would argue significantly now that they're like in that 28, 27, 28 to 42, 43 range, right? These are folks who are entering prime leadership age and need to be mentored. Millennials are now the largest generation in the workforce and are going to have the means and expertise to shape Jewish life. Their wants and needs are inevitably going to shape our institutions for good and for change. And philanthropically, they're actually set to inherit trillions of dollars in wealth from their baby boomer parents in the years ahead. So cultivating good philanthropic habits now will have the ability to have a much larger impact down the road. So I mentioned before some of these statistics as it relates to the Orthodox Jewish community and the non-Orthodox Jewish community. And knowing that Gratz is pluralistic, I want to add a little bit of frame and color to this. So for most non-Orthodox, well, let me reframe. There's an amazing podcast out there called the Judaism Unbound podcast. Highly recommend it. And the hosts are Dan Liebenson and Rabbi Lex Rofberg. And many, many years ago, probably almost a decade ago, they were having a conversation that really stuck with me and that I've used as the frame for how I think about engaging millennials in Jewish life. For the Orthodox world, and for some choice select members of the non-Orthodox world, Judaism is an operating system. If you think about your cell phone, the operating system is what's happening behind the scenes. It's the platform that everything else runs on. For the overwhelming majority of North American Jewry who are not Orthodox, Judaism is an app, like one of the many app options that you have on your phone that you can pick and enter at any given time. So for those for whom Judaism is their operating system, that's the lens through which they see Jewish life always. It isn't even a question. The rhythm of the holiday calendar and Shabbat every week and all of these things, that's normative. That's just the lens through which they see life. For the overwhelming majority of North American Jews, millennials included, Judaism is an app. And as an app, Judaism is competing for the attention of each of those people, along with every other app in the App Store or marketplace. And then the goal becomes, how do we inspire folks to open the app more and more frequently? Just like all of those social media companies that really want you to open and become addicted to their apps, how are we making Judaism addictive? How are we making that app addictive? How are we getting people into a rhythm where they are so inspired and wanting to open the app? And then for some folks, the goal becomes, how do we then get them to open it so frequently that they just say, we might as well just keep it open all the time, and it becomes operating system. And there are other folks who say it's totally reasonable and wonderful if they're just engaging with our app on a regular basis, the app that is Judaism. Much of my work and focus as it relates to how to engage millennials is for app Jews as opposed to operating system Jews. Although I'll share, just like you need a software update sometimes, even the operating systems themselves sometimes are updated and need to be updated. So whether you're going from Mac Sierra to the Mac whatever, like sometimes even the operating systems get updated in different ways, just as Judaism has over the millennia. And much of what we're sharing now may still also apply to operating system Jews, but it's really designed for app Jews. So I want to dive in a little bit to talk about some core engagement techniques. So you have your random millennial, late 20 to early 40 something person. What are some of the techniques that we can use in order to weave these people into community? And as my teacher, Ron Wolfson, would say, the most important thing you can do is what he calls relational Judaism, but it's begin building a relationship. And the easiest and best way to build a relationship, in my experience, is to sit down with someone one-on-one over a cup of coffee, or in my case, tea. I'm not a coffee drinker, I'm a tea drinker. And as my dentist reminds me, tea actually stains your teeth way worse than coffee. But what's powerful about a one-on-one coffee date? You're in a public place. So if you're meeting someone for the first time, there's at least a barista there, let alone other guests. So there's a comparative level of comfort that comes with that. But more importantly, it creates the opportunity to get to know people, to make them feel seen and heard and appreciated, and for you to be capital P present and to ask questions and to embrace that whole God gave you two ears and one mouth for a reason philosophy in order to get to really know somebody. And for them to get to know you, but more importantly, you them, if you're looking to weave them into community. Coffee dates are awesome, truly. Like it's the best part of someone's life. No, the thing that people love most is talking about themselves. So if you create space for someone to share about themselves and their interests and their passions with you, that's a really wonderful thing. And they're going to feel seen and heard. And then you have the opportunity to follow up. And if you do this well and do this right, you're actively listening. And then after the coffee date, you're taking notes and you're saying they're really passionate about A, B, C, D. And if we're doing it right, we're going to say, who in the network, whether that's in our congregation, in our community, in our federation, whatever it might be, who are they going to be best friends with? Who do we need to introduce this person to, or who are the people we need to introduce this person to in order to make it so that they find someone that they're like-minded with, that they're going to come and join us. The meta curriculum of all of the work that we did at the Well and that informs this book is that the only reason anyone's going to get up off of the couch from watching Netflix and put on real pants as opposed to sweatpants is because they have friends to reach out to go and do Jewish things with, or they have friends who are inviting them to go and do Jewish things with them. There are a huge chunk of millennial Jews for whom the majority of their friend groups do not happen to be Jewish. And as a result, there's no way that they're going to be invited to go do Jewish things with those friends or feel that they have friends to invite to go and do Jewish things with. So helping people craft Jewish friendships should be a key goal of our community when we're thinking about how is it that we're actually going to weave people in. And in doing so, we're combating millennial loneliness that we spoke about earlier because we're giving people to them to do Jewish and also life with. So you go on a coffee date with somebody. It's a really lovely conversation. What comes next? We have kind of a historic vehicle in our community that is one of the most powerful community building vessels that we possibly have. And those are Shabbat dinners. People love dinner parties, and millennials also love dinner parties. What I'll say is that there's a distinction between a dinner party that's just open to anybody and hundreds of people come, or a curated, plated dinner where you make sure that the people around your table are the folks that you think are going to be best friends with one another. And the ultimate measure of success is at the end of the night with you saying, without you having to say anything, these folks are exchanging their cell phone numbers, right? That they're finding ways to connect and get together independent of you as the person who wove everybody together, courtesy of having a curated guest list. So Priya Parker writes about this in her book, The Art of Gathering, which is exceptional. But basically, there's this notion of sometimes this kind of Christian ethos that we've embraced in the Jewish community for good reason of, oh, there's always room for another person at the table, that sometimes the need exists to actually say, this is an intentional gathering of a particular group of folks, and not just anybody can show up, because if the wrong person shows up and it ruins the mood, it actually defeats the purpose of this particular gathering. So it's a little countercultural for us as Jews to be like, no, I'm sorry, you're not invited to this dinner, especially if you're running an organization that bills itself as inclusive. But ultimately, once people understand that you're bringing thoughtfulness and intentionality to crafting and cultivating, that's really important. Now, for a lot of millennials, this is countercultural because you would invite on a Tuesday for a Friday night dinner and they say, okay, great, I'll see if I can make it. And it's like, no, I don't think you understand. We're having a plated meal and we're inviting you to take a seat at that table. For millennials in particular, this notion of FOMO, the fear of missing out, is very real within the generation. And there are folks who are loath to commit to doing something because there may be something more interesting that comes along the way that they would rather do, but oftentimes in the end, they end up doing nothing. So it's countercultural for some to commit in advance, but if you've had that coffee date, started to establish and build that relationship of trust and reached out and invited them in, you've got a real shot at it. So what we see from the data that comes from Pew and elsewhere is that the frequency of participation in Jewish life really, really matters. I'm talking about opening the app, inspiring people with regularity to open the app. Opening the app begets more opening of the app. And the question we wanted to explore was, for millennials, how often should we be trying to inspire them to open the app? And what we found was that at the very least, opening the app of Jewish life, again, app is just like a stand-in for inspiring them to participate and do something actively Jewish as part of Jewish community. Striving for at least a monthly participation led to more and more repetition and participation throughout the community in other ways, as opposed to simply aiming for a quarterly touch or every 6 months or the high holidays or anything along those lines. In one way, to weave folks into community, help them find their best friends, and help them get into the rhythm is by crafting small groups, what we called shared interest groups. And whether those were couples Shabbat dinner groups or charity poker giving circles or young family play groups or women's new moon Rosh Chodesh groups, or my personal favorite and the most delicious, the Indian lunch buffet exploration group, because there are a lot of folks who have partners who don't love Indian food, even though they do, and they were looking for people to eat Indian food with. How do we go about bringing people together around shared passions, like-mindedness, whatever it might be, to give them folks to connect and to do Jewish life with? So small groups are an incredible tool. They've been used in mega churches for many, many years. There are certain synagogues that are adopting those practices now, but having the opportunity to weave people together with like-minded folks around shared passion or interest, democratize the power structure, and give them the opportunity and buy-in to host on a monthly basis, rotating leadership through the group, still resonates with millennials. It's a little bit like the Chavurah movements of old, and has tremendous power and potential for impact and for helping people find their people. Sorry, one sec, get a little drink. So one of the chapters in the book I title Field of Dreams Got It Wrong. For a long time in the Jewish world, what we've done is we said, if we build it, they will come, right? And the reality is that for millennials, if we build it, they will come is not the model, but rather it's if we invite them to build it with us, they will come and bring their friends. It's a little clunkier, I get it, but that's the reality. So striving for what I would call empowerment-centric co-creation. This notion that we're not going to create things from the top down and try to attract people to it, but rather we're going to engage in a co-creative process with the folks that we're trying to attract and target, such that they tell us what it is they want to do. They bring their ideas to the table. We help execute those ideas, and they come and they bring their friends because they're so excited because they were part of the planning process that actually led to the gathering happening. So for a lot of our institutions, we have program directors and we're going to create programs, and then we hope that we're going to attract people to the programs. Admittedly, it takes much more work to be involved in a co-creative process because you have to have a lot more people's involved in their ideas and input and all of those pieces. But ultimately, if you want millennials to participate in something, having them be part of the planning process is essential. And having the person who reaches out to them to invite them be their friend rather than the professional, also key. Our community has, I'm certainly not the first to coin this term or to use it in this way, we have an edifice complex. We love our buildings. we really love our buildings. And for so many of our institutions, success is measured by how many tushes are in seats in our buildings. And this is incredibly problematic for a whole slew of reasons. Coming back to Priya Parker, who I mentioned earlier in The Art of Gathering, the goal of any particular gathering should be to look at the ideal outcomes. What are the goals? What are we trying to accomplish? And then let's look at the inputs that we need in order to help us accomplish our goals. And for so many folks, the input that they just default to is, oh, well, we're going to do the event in our building, in our space, our synagogue, our JCC, our federation, whatever it might be, even if that's not necessarily the best input, the best venue in which to help achieve or accomplish the outcomes that we're trying to make happen. So the language that I like to use is our buildings are important, and I get it. As someone who ran an organization without a building and with a building, what I can tell you is when you have a building, you wish you didn't, and when you don't have a building, you wish you did. But ultimately, we cannot measure success by how many people are entering our buildings. As it relates to building Jewish community and helping people thrive using the Jewish wisdom tradition, I like to think of it in a comics construct, right? So think about Batman. You probably didn't expect to hear about Batman tonight, right? Think about Batman. Batman has a superhero tool belt. And on that tool belt, he has lots of different things. He has the wire thing. He has his batarangs. He has his flash boom things, whatever it is, you have a superhero tool belt. For our Jewish organizations, our buildings, our physical structures need to be one tool on our superhero community building tool belts. Too often, what happens is that it is the only tool on our superhero utility tool belts, or it's an anvil that is pulling our pants down because it's got 30 years worth of deferred maintenance and it's crumbling, and every dollar that we take has to go towards redoing the bathrooms or whatever it is, right? So the building is one piece and needs to be a piece of how we build robust and inspired Jewish community, but it can't be the piece, the only piece, and it certainly can't be the only measure of success is how many people are coming into our buildings. I have I don't want to use the word vendetta. I really struggle with the Jewish community's embrace of the word free. The word free has been used to try to attract millennials to things, not only for samples at Costco, right? The word free has been put on everything from Birthright to PJ Library to every Hillel and Chabad on campus to Moishe House events, everywhere in between. The word free is going on everything as a mechanism for trying to attract millennials because, let's face it, most people will do something once for free. The reality, though, is that none of these things are free. None of these experiences are free. We are actively educating passively this generation to suggest that they do not need to invest in Jewish life in order to benefit of all that Jewish life has to offer. So there's a whole chapter in the book, but it's all about, in my perspective, the word free is incredibly troubling, and that the language choices we use really matter. And I'm kind of on the bandwagon of trying to inspire the entire Jewish world to think that maybe don't use the word free anymore, and that the closest we should ever come is to say, this particular event or gathering or experience, whatever it might be, it's at no cost to you due to the generosity of donors. And the actual cost is X, whatever that cost is. And if you're really smart about it, you'll get up in front of that group, and once they're there, say, we're so happy that you're here. A friendly reminder that you paid X or did not pay a significant amount, or it was complimentary or at no cost to you due to the generosity of donors to attend this evening. And the actual cost is X, and you're being invested in with the hope and the expectation that as you grow in your careers and lives and means, that you are going to pay it forward and invest in future generations as well. And I think that's just a whole piece of the conversation that's really been lost. Millennials will pay for things they value. Millennials pay for avocado toast. Millennials pay for gym members. Like, millennials will pay for things they value, but they won't pay for things that they aren't using. So the question becomes, how do we inspire and engage millennials in an era where they're not particularly keen on membership because they don't want the labels, all of those things. It's really, really important that we create spaces and opportunities to educate these folks towards philanthropy, because even for our organizations that have membership constructs, it's actually philanthropy that's sustaining them, right? I'm not aware of, I shouldn't say that. There are very few synagogues that I've ever come across, for example, where membership dues alone actually cover the operating budget. Philanthropy is a significant chunk of synagogue revenue. So too with Jewish community centers, let alone the purely philanthropic, Jewish federations, the folks who aren't selling services the way that JCCs are or that synagogues are offering, right? There's no question that we need to be creating models that people are willing to pay for, but we can't expect millennials to pay for things that they're not using. Personal customization is the dominant ethos of the day. Think about if you go to Chipotle or any other of these fast casual buffet line styles. I want this and this and not this and this and not this, right? That kind of goes in your bowl. Bundling and unbundling. If you think about the cable revolution, the cable revolution and how everyone stopped paying for cable TV because they wanted Disney Plus and Hulu, but not the Netflix or this or that. And somehow people want to be able to choose the things that they want. We're seeing it in secular society too. So much of what happens in the Jewish world is reflective of what's happening in the secular world. It is much less frequent that people are buying season passes to the opera or to the traveling musical theater. They're more likely to pick the two shows that they really want to see and buy the shows that they really want. So we need to be thinking creatively about how it is that we are bundling or unbundling what it is that our community is offering in various modes in order to connect with millennials. And then once we're able to get them in to whatever it is they're self-selecting, then it's incumbent upon us in order to build the relationships and to dive into constructing those relationships. Another approach we're thinking about is utilizing constructs that we know millennials are willing to pay for, and then Jewifying them, so to speak, in a way that helps us accomplish our goals. So in our case at the Well in Detroit, it's let's build a Passover Seder-inspired escape room. And we're going to do this professionally. And we hire a professional escape room designer for Los Angeles, and we infuse it with Jewish content. And we pop up and run this thing commercially for 2 weeks leading up to Passover, charging $100 a ticket for up to a group of 8 people. We sell thousands and thousands of dollars worth of tickets, covering the cost of what it was to commission. And then we license it out to other communities around the country, giving them the opportunity to pop it up at next to no cost in their community so they can make money while accomplishing Jewish experiential educational goals. So how can we find the things that we know that Jewish millennials are willing to pay for anyway? And what I've found and learned, and what the data is showing, is that all else being equal, Jewish millennials will make Jewish choices. So if it's a Jewish nursery school and a non-Jewish nursery school, if the cost is relatively the same and the distance relatively the same, like all else being equal, folks are making the Jewish choice. Once the Jewish choice is significantly more expensive or inconvenient or is closed for too many days due to holidays, that's a really tough one to combat, by the way, then folks are more inclined to be open to making the non-Jewish choice. But all else being equal, what I'm seeing and have experienced both anecdotally and what I'm seeing in the data is that Jewish millennials will make Jewish choices. I want to come back to millennial philanthropy for a moment. Millennials earn 20% less than baby boomers did at the same stage of life, despite having higher levels of education. Almost 75% of millennials made a charitable donation during the first 6 months of COVID, which was a higher clip than any other generation. 84% of millennials give to charity annually. However, they currently donate annually on average under $500 a year. However, as I mentioned earlier, the baby boomer generation, it's anticipated, will be passing down over $30 trillion in inheritance to millennials in the coming decades. So there's money that will be coming in, and thus cultivating them now as donors who are in the habit of giving regularly is important. But we should know that only 50% of millennials are giving to causes that their parents give to. That a huge chunk of Jewish philanthropic dollars in this country already, regardless of generation, the overwhelming majority go to non-Jewish causes, not to Jewish causes. And And millennials are not necessarily going to give to the same places that their parents did, even if they themselves ultimately are giving. Now, there are different ways to connect with millennials philanthropically. Challenge grants can help. People of all generations are often inspired by matching grants. For millennials in particular, which is an attention deficit generation, if I can frame it that way, where they're known for reading headlines exclusively because you're competing in the attention economy for everybody's attention. The brevity of campaign matters. I'm running a Jewish federation right now. It's very challenging to lean into a sense of urgency when we've got an annual campaign that lasts the whole year. That's very different than we've got 3 days to raise this amount of money, and if you give right now, it's going to be doubled, right? So the brevity of a campaign matters. Short bursts, sense of urgency are key. Personal asks are key. Leaning into peer pressure. Think about all of the people who've said, I'm running this race and I invite you to come and donate, right? Peer pressure plays a role. So too the notion in certain communities of folks wanting to be like their peers who are giving at a certain level and are getting the kavod or respect at those different levels. For a lot of millennials for whom money is tight, lining up a small monthly recurring donation as opposed to a lump sum is definitely a worthwhile strategy to pursue. And then this is the hard part, because for more seasoned generations, giving was often expected. It's what you did. For millennials, the desire is there to be thanked and thanked and thanked, even if they made an incredibly modest donation. And this is a really, really hard thing in intergenerational settings to get across. Even if a millennial gives $36, they're expecting a thank you, and they want to be thanked for their generosity at a $36 donation. And finding creative ways to express that gratitude is really, really important. One of the ways that we played with and ultimately found successful was actually doing personalized shout out on people's Facebook walls. Donors love seeing their names on walls. Those are physical walls, but Facebook walls were another avenue where we could say nice things about people. And this isn't simply a thank you, Samantha, for your $18 donation. This was rather a Samantha is the most wonderful, thoughtful, kind, and smart person, and we are so grateful for her support and all the ways in which she shows up for community, and we are grateful to be building the well with her. And what we found was that by doing public social media gratitude posts, while we were saying nice things about people, other people were inspired to donate as well because they wanted to see what nice things we would have to say about them. So in back-to-back years, we raised over $100,000 from more than 400 young adults in their 20s and 30s in Metro Detroit, a modest community. So the opportunity is there if embraced. So emphasizing the impact of the donation, even if it's modest, using phone technology, social media, whatever it is. I just had an article come out a couple of weeks ago in the Jerusalem Post, an op-ed. It's a little bit controversial, but really suggested that we move away from putting names on walls, certainly as it relates to in perpetuity, but maybe think of it more like naming construct for stadium rights, naming rights for stadiums, where maybe you get 20 years in exchange for the gift, and then it gives the organization a chance to move, downsize, merge, or bid out again to make sure that there's fresh cash that's coming in to support the organization going forward. But I'm a huge fan of endowing programs, positions, and obviously lectures. So I'm grateful to be here for that. A couple more things that I want to throw out there before I open up for questions. Obviously, I'm not going through all the pieces of the book, but really trying to drive towards give background information in terms of how do we think about this generation? What makes them unique? What are the different ways we can engage? I think that we have to be really careful in the Jewish world about the language that we use. Language really matters. Avoiding masculine pronouns for God or Old English. I have a quote in the book that says, if I could, I would maketh it so that the word maketh is never used in a Jewish setting ever again. And I have a lot of colleagues who disagree with me on that one, particularly as it relates to Psalm 23. He maketh me lie down in green pastures. From my perspective, it makes us sound like 18th century Christians, but also particularly just outdated and not contemporarily relevant for a generation that is deeply craving relevance. So too, I think we have to be careful with the word God. The word God for a lot of people is a loaded word. One of my favor, and we don't want to assume millennial theology, right? So chapter 9 in the book is overwhelmingly about millennial theology, but God is a loaded word for a lot of people. And the classic joke of, there's the young boy whose father goes to synagogue regularly every week, even though he's an avowed atheist. And the little boy says, Dad, I don't get it. Why are you going to synagogue? You don't believe in God. You've told me that. And he's like, well, my friend Goldberg? Yeah. Well, my friend Goldberg goes to synagogue to talk to God, and I go to synagogue to talk to Goldberg, right? That there's a lot of folks in our tradition that community, even in synagogue settings, is what it's all about. So being thoughtful about how are we crafting and cultivating experiences for the folks who are going in order to chat with their friends and aren't particularly interested in praying. What does that look like? And what if on the high holidays we brought equal amounts of intention to what's happening in a main sanctuary to what's happening in the lobby? And just a different way of thinking about that. So too, we have a real issue with pediatric Judaism in our community. And as a Jewish educator and someone who is trained at amazing institutions like Gratz, for me, this is something that I've been combating throughout my career, is most folks, if they've had any sort of formal Jewish education, it ends at their bar bat or bar mitzvah. And then they don't grow in their Jewish learning. And there's only so many things that you can teach to a preteen. We have incredible pieces of our tradition that are completely inappropriate. Just during Passover on the Shabbat of Chol HaMoed, in between the Yontif days, traditionally we read the Song of Songs, which is the erotic poetry section of the Hebrew Bible. I can't teach that to 12-year-olds and keep my job, right? But there's incredible stuff in this tradition, and people don't know to look for it. They don't think that it exists. That's why they often go and find themselves with gurus and on yoga mats and exploring other spiritual traditions, because they think their tradition is pediatric. And the only time many of them engage with the Jewish wisdom tradition is what they find in their holiday prayer book, where you find a lot of imagery and poetry, but they think it's literal, and it's not, and it was never meant to be. So coupled with the fact that many of our places are still having prayer take place in Hebrew, and most people are not speaking Hebrew or reading Hebrew, no one likes feeling stupid, and no one likes feeling stupid surrounded by something that's supposed to be theirs and that they're supposed to be part of. So thinking creatively about how are we creating spaces where folks, even if they don't have extensive learning backgrounds, can feel comfortable, inspired, and want to dive in is really important. We talked a little bit earlier about intermarriage statistics. I just want to acknowledge in this way, interfaith marriages are a reality of our community. And figuring out how we welcome in versus push out is essential. The majority of interfaith couples in this country are raising their children Jewish. And that's not a statistic that most people know. The Pew survey in 2020 showed that the majority are raising their children Jewish. Now, there's a distinction because they're being raised culturally Jewish as opposed to religiously Jewish in many of those cases. And there are differentiated outcomes for those who are raised culturally Jewish versus religiously Jewish. But they are still being raised Jewish. And I think it's important to mention that and throw that out. And also back to the philanthropy, knowing that 80% of couples make charitable giving decisions as a couple and not as individuals. If we want Jewish people who are overwhelmingly intermarried to invest in Jewish world and Jewish life going forward, we have to make sure that we're also making sure that we have to make sure that the non-Jewish partner is also feeling attached, connected, appreciated, and part of community. So my favorite story, there's lots more that I could go into, obviously, but I want to create space for questions and honor everybody's time. But one of my favorite stories from our tradition is about Moses, who apparently had time traveling skills. So Moses goes and he time travels, and he ends up in Rabbi Akiva's classroom, many, 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 many years later. And he's looking around and he's listening, and he's like, I don't know any of this. This is not the Torah that I brought down from God at Sinai and handed over. But then ultimately, Rabbi Akiva teaches a halacha, a piece of the law, and says this is from Torah LaMoshe Sinai. This is like God to Moses at Sinai. This is from our tradition. And Moses is like comforted by this imaginary time travel episode. We have beautiful stuff like this throughout our tradition that is not just purely legalistic halachic, but is agadic and storytelling. And I think the major takeaway from this is we're in a period of transition. The Jewish world is in a period of transition. The institutions that we built were built for a certain time and place. Israel came along and was created in 48, which totally shifted how the Jewish world was operating in its landscape as well with that incredible project, right? We're charting our course right now. Some would say we're even wandering through the desert trying to figure out what is this next iteration of Jewish life going to be. And for me, the reason that I love engaging with millennials in this generation, the reason I love the work that I do is that I feel like I have the privilege of helping to craft, shape, and move the Jewish world along to whatever's coming next, for good and for change. And I don't know. Someone asked me the other day, Dan, what's the Jewish world going to look like 30 years from now, 40 years from now, when you're winding down your career? And the truth is, I don't know. But it's definitely going to look different than it looks today. And I'm really, really excited to be part of the journey that helps realize and unfold whatever that's going to be. So I'm going to stop there in order to create space for questions, but a huge thank you again to everyone at Graz for having me. It's truly a privilege to be able to come and share some of these ideas with everybody. And I look forward to engaging in any and all ways.
Thank you, Rabbi Horwitz. That was wonderful. You can't see my text messages, but I got a number of text messages while you were speaking, talking about how great you were. So you can let your mother know. But so we have a few questions. First two questions actually came up. They were similar, not exactly the same. So I'll sort of ask them as like a group. But there is an interest in knowing how do people of, like, not the same generation as millennials, older generations, seek out millennials to invite them for coffee or invite them to Shabbat. And then I guess connected to that are there challenges or opportunities, or what are the challenges and opportunities when there's intergenerational outreach amongst millennials?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's group of questions number one.
Group of questions number one. All right, these are great questions. These are great questions. So what I would say is, when we were doing coffee dating, and in the end, we were, doing 500-600 coffee dates a year with people in the community. It's really important to think about who the right person is to have the coffee date. And there were plenty of times where that wasn't me. And there may be other folks in different generations or different interests or different life stages who would be the right person to have the coffee with the person, depending on who the person was. So I think it's really important, and that wasn't always professional. It was also empowering our laity. So it was saying, hey, this person came across our desk and here's what we know about them. Who's the person on our team who would be the right person to go and connect with this person in order to figure out how to start building a relationship of trust and how to weave these folks into community? So it could very well be that somebody on a staff team who is 57 years old may not be the right person to go and have that one-on-one coffee with a 28-year-old. It could very well be because they have a shared interest, or they're both attorneys, or they're whatever, right? But having something to jump off of initially in terms of the relationship building piece, in my experience, is really important. And it's also just a beautiful way to train and empower your lay leaders as well, to feel a sense of ownership for the organization and to be an anchor for those folks moving forward. There are definitely intergenerational challenges that are going to exist in doing this work. I don't want to suggest otherwise. I think it depends again on the maturity and the life stage, and right. So if somebody is 27 years old and single, the likelihood that where they want to spend their Friday night is at a Shabbat dinner with a group of strangers who are overwhelmingly sexa or septa or octogenarians, that may not necessarily be what they're in the mood to do. I think it has to be framed in terms of who's coming, why are they coming, what's the purpose of the gathering. Believe it or not, a lot of millennials are not interested in being set up by others. And certainly are not interested in singles. Well, let me reframe. They're not interested in singles events, and they're definitely not interested in being sneak attacked as it relates to trying to create shidduchim or matches. They are interested in having friends of friends facilitate. There's a lot of fatigue with the dating apps and things of that nature now. So, but just a random, hey, come to my house for Shabbat dinner, and I'm going to invite a whole bunch of eligible people. That's less likely to speak to folks in this generation. From what we're seeing. Overall, there needs to be elements of trust. And if at any point in time there is a sense from the millennial that you're trying to engage, that you're not actually genuinely interested in them as a person and weaving them into community to their benefit, but rather the reason you want to get to know them is because you want them to join your thing or give you their money, then you've immediately lost. So the entire approach needs to be based on an Erwin Kula-esque. Rabbi Erwin Kula is kind of one of the Jewish world's leading heretics and amazing and an 8th or 9th generation rabbi, but he's very much as like the reason Judaism exists is to help human beings flourish, right? So if you're having coffee with someone because you're really excited about helping them flourish and live the best life they possibly can, that's going to come across one way. And if you're having coffee with someone because what you really want is somebody to come and join your shul so that you can keep having the shul because we need the membership dollars for the young people or else the shul goes away, they're going to be able to sniff that out right away. And it's not going to result in what you're hoping it will result in.
Thank you. So there's a lot of interest in relationship between millennials and the Orthodox community, or Orthodox millennials, or the future and how that looks. I'm sort of trying to weave in a number of different questions that have come out, but I think one question would be, what percentage of millennials are Orthodox or somewhere in between? As we know, they don't like classification, so much. Also, and then I don't know if you can speak in generalities, but what is the relationship between millennials and the Orthodox world in the future, and how do you see that impacting the relationship between the Orthodox world and the non-Orthodox world in the future?
Yeah. So my sense in terms of the demographics on this, I don't have the exact number. I would be shocked if percentage of millennials who are Orthodox or self-identify Orthodox would be lower or higher than the national average, which at any given time is probably in that like 10 to 12% range. Maybe a little higher if once you get younger, just because of birth rates, right? But so there are not the overwhelming majority of North American Jewish millennials are not people who would self-identify as Orthodox. So that's kind of that first piece of it. In terms of the relationship to Orthodoxy, look, it's hard for me because I am a pluralistic Jew and comfortably move in and out of different spaces, but I would be the first to tell you, and I write about it in the book as well, theologically speaking, Orthodox Judaism and Reform Judaism are arguably different religions, right? Same shared core text, same, it's a very interesting thing that it was partially because we're small, we're a minority, we're in this persecuted bubble, but no one would expect Catholics to raise money to donate for Protestant causes or schools in a way that we in the Jewish community, we raise money in federations and give to all different types, all of these kinds, we raise from LGBTQ plus folks and give money to Orthodox yeshivas that say that shouldn't necessarily be the way people are living their lives. And we raise money from the Orthodox world in order to support those programs. So it's a very interesting mashup in reality. My sense is we're already seeing significant splits. Now, there may be Jewish unity as it relates sometimes to Israel, sometimes to this, the Hitler-esque definition of if you have at least one Jewish grandparent, you're Jewish as it relates to, they tried to wipe us out, those pieces. But we're seeing a lot of issues already with the Rabbanut in Israel and who can get married in Israel, and are Reform conversions in the diaspora recognizable to get married in Israel? The answer is no, right? We have a lot of issues already within our communities trying to one-up each other in terms of holier than thou, or who's more authentic Torah Judaism, or these pieces. So I think for me, there are going to be moments for Big Tent and moments for Klal Yisrael. But one of the emerging realities that we're seeing now, particularly due to the overwhelming majority of non-Orthodox millennials marrying a non-Jewish partner, is that they're going to have much more in common with the non-Jewish partner and their family and their non-Jewish neighbors than they're going to with people who are dressed in Hasidic garb and who are in Crown Heights, right? And that, I think, it's a real challenge and struggle in this moment. For me, I lean into a construct of striving to embrace unity but not uniformity. And it's easier for me to say that as a non-Orthodox Jew, because you have people like Rabbi Ari Shafrin of Agudath Israel, like the mainstream American Haredi org, who come out and basically say, we will love the people who are Jewish as Jewish, but we will never acknowledge and respect and accept that there are other ways of being Jewish other than our way of being Jewish. So Jewish pluralism, for most, tends to be skewing to the liberal denominations. I think you see with Chovevei Torah and some of the modern Orthodox iterations, you see a lot of folks, even growing up in the conservative movement, who now skew towards the modern Orthodox because that's where they're finding community and people who are similarly committed and those kinds of things. So Orthodoxy itself is by no means monolithic when we talk about Orthodox. There's all different flavors and constructs of Orthodoxy as well. So my sense is, I don't know that it's reasonable to expect everyone to exist underneath the same tent. My sense is the reason that we do is because people hate the Jews, and thus we get looped together in this way, for better or worse. And there are moments where I wonder what it would look like if we didn't feel like we had to worry about the others, whether we would thrive differently, grow differently. I'm not advocating for that necessarily, again, as somebody who values Jewish unity and feels that there's beauty in the myriad forms of Jewish practice and expression.
So I'm going to ask one final question. We're about the same age. We are both older millennials. We both have Israel decorations behind us. But right now we're in a pretty challenging time for the Jewish community around Israel. I think a lot of people are very worried about younger generations and their connection with Israel. And I think some people are curious, including me, about your experience leading a Jewish community in this challenging time in general, and maybe how has that looked like specifically for millennials, or even if you can weave in a little bit of how to extrapolate for Gen X and to think of answers there as well, would be interesting.
Sure. Look, so Israel is miraculous from my perspective. I'm the grandchild of Holocaust survivors. Both of my grandmothers are survivors. And I can only imagine how many more family members I would have right now in my extended family tree had Israel existed earlier in the 20th century than it did. I think that we in the Jewish community have done, I don't want to say a disservice, but there's been a real emphasis historically on Israel advocacy and less of an emphasis on Israel education. And I think that advocacy is fine and great, but absent strong education, what ends up happening is that, and even now, the immediate response to what's happening on campus, which I understand, is to say we need to arm our teenagers with talking points. They need to know how to be warriors for Israel on campus and to answer anything that anyone might throw at them with talking points. Let's get them to memorize talking points. And then what happens is that they go to a place where they're challenged to open their minds and explore and ask hard questions, which is a very Jewish value and what we want. And someone comes at them with something that they don't have a response to with one of their talking points. And what happens? They're lost, right? For most of these folks, the only Israel experience they have, if they have it at all, is a birthright Israel experience. And I and many of those folks fall in love with Israel, going on birthright Israel. But I would argue they're not actually falling in love, they're falling in lust. Because Israel's sexy, right? This is the whole, you've got beaches and you've got hummus and you've got soldiers and they're gorgeous and they don't look like us. And right, all of these, like, Israel is sexy, so you lust for Israel. But as anybody who's in a deep relationship with somebody knows, you don't wake up next to somebody after being married for 10 years and they're wearing makeup and their hair is perfect and they're wearing an amazing outfit. Their hair is down and the makeup is smeared, or they forgot to take it off because the kids were screaming and you were up in the middle of the night and you're exhausted and you have to mobilize for work. Like, love is different than lust. And I think that as a Jewish community, we've started to move in the right direction. It's okay to pique that interest with birthright, but we have not done a great job of following up with substantive Israel education afterwards. Instead, trying to have mercenaries rather than people who actually love, by trying to arm them with talking points rather than have them actually get to explore. Now, I spoke earlier about pediatric Judaism. The reality is for most folks, they're not self-selecting in order to do Jewish learning, and that is very problematic, let alone from high school years on. if you get any amount of time with them, it's a huge win. And how are you filling that time? Because yes, I want them to love Israel and learn all about Israel education, but I also want them to get substantive Jewish education and Torah learning and spoken Hebrew, let alone davening Hebrew, or like there's so many things within our tradition that I think for me, making sure that as educators, we're always framing this as, and it's why in my bio I put that I'm a lifelong learner, right? Like my goal is to always be learning and growing, to not feel like somehow, even though I just turned 40, guess what? In our tradition, you're not even supposed to start studying Kabbalah till you're 40, right? Like I just turned 40. There's so much of our tradition, and I'm the rabbi, that I don't even know yet. And that's okay. It's truly okay. And it's something we embrace because my goal is that I'm going to be learning new things all the way up until my time walking in this world expires. And that's the beauty of our tradition and what it can offer. So how are we creating avenues for folks that they don't have to feel self-conscious or shamed or whatever for not knowing enough, but how are we helping to work them into a rhythm where they understand that the goal and the vision is to constantly be learning and growing along the way. And if we can move to that sort of construct and mold, then we can bring more intention and priorities to where along the journey and when do we think it's most important for what should people be studying at those different pieces. So
Thank you. There are a lot more questions, but not that much more time. And you can look them up on the Nashville Federation webpage if you want to email them. And we're really appreciative, Dan. This was a great talk, and hopefully, in the merits of so many people coming to hear you talk about how to engage more Jews will be engaged in the long run. And so thank you everybody for coming. And if you're looking for ways to be engaged, please check the Gratz website. We've got adult Jewish learning classes that are just launching for the summer, as well as a constant stream of programming and other opportunities. So thank you everybody for coming out. Thank you to Mrs. Joan Wall and sponsoring and Pulaski family for sponsoring this lecture. And hopefully everybody has a good evening and a good night. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Take care, everyone.